Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad that you joined us. My name is Yolie Flores. I'm the National Campaign Director for Parent Nation at the TMW Center at the University of Chicago. And I'm so thrilled that you're here with us today for this conversation with three EdTech leaders who have joined us. And in a moment, I'll have them each say a little bit about themselves, and I will introduce them as well. Our conversation today will begin to reflect on EdTech's challenges and successes with school-age children that was experienced during the last 2 years in the pandemic. We'll talk about what we learned about how children engage or struggle with educational software and how it can be improved to meet their needs. And then we'll explore how the pandemic, more broadly, will permanently impact the shape the trajectory of EdTech development and entrepreneurship in the future. With that, let me introduce our panel. Just a second. And again, I will have them say a little bit about themselves. We won't read bios today, but you do have them in your app. And before we start, let me just also ask you to take your app and go to the Engage section for today. And in there, you will be able to ask questions during our conversation and after. Okay. Something's going on with my phone. Hang on a second. Okay. So, to my furthest right is Amelia Kelly. Amelia is VP of Technology at Soapbox Labs. Next to Amelia is Karina Linch. She is Chief Product Officer at Brainpop. And right next to me is Kylie Burke, co-founder of Noni Educational Solutions. So I'm going to have each of them, hello all three of you. We have both personally and professionally had the most challenging experiences over the last 2 years. The pandemic both illuminated some very powerful successes, particularly as it relates to technology. But it also asked us to confront some challenges. But I want to start us off with the silver linings. What good came out of these difficult 2 years? And I really want you to speak to this both in your professional world, but also as parents. What good came out of it, especially as it relates to children's learning and ed technology? So Amelia, I'm going to have you start us off.
Sure, happy to, and thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, I'm Amelia Kelly. I'm the VP of Speech Technology at Soapbox Labs. We're a technology company that build speech recognition software that focuses specifically on children's speech. So when the pandemic started a few years ago, we were working on a fluency product within the company that would use voice technology to analyze children's speech when they're practicing reading and provide analysis of how well they read, how closely what they said matched the text, etc. So we were working on this and talking to some interested clients, and then the pandemic hit. And we went from a situation where, we talked to EdTech companies and they would be looking for a technology solution maybe the following year or even the year after. In this case, we were talking to Amplify and they said, whoa, hold up, we need this immediately. We need it by back to school 2020. And it was all hands on deck in the company then working on this technology. So I think speech technology is really, really important for literacy, for language learning, for a lot of educational applications. I think what the pandemic taught us is that people are more ready than we thought to adopt these technologies, and that these technologies hopefully, and I'd love to see the benefit benefit of this, now that more and more people are taking it on, that we can help close this literacy gap, which I think has gotten wider with COVID. I have a daughter myself. She was only 1.5 when the pandemic hit. She's now 3.5, almost 4, and she has engaged somewhat with the different technologies like Lingo Kids and things like that. But you know, I really see. I saw her trying to engage with certain speech technology applications, and they didn't work for her speech because she was, you know, a 2-year-old child. What I did find, though, was, you know, it's very convenient having a 2-year-old child when you work in a speech technology company, because sometimes we call them speakers instead of children. We had her test our technology, and we were not very surprised, but very happy to see that it worked very, very well for her speech. And we get feedback back from our clients as well who have English language learning apps, and they say that there are 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds playing and engaging with their apps, and they're getting real-time feedback of their attempts at pronouncing words in English, for example. And these kids, again, are as young as 2, 3. The technology we build, we put a lot of effort into dealing with kids' speech, their voices and their language behaviours and patterns. So I'm glad to see it paying off, and I hope that EdTech companies continue to adopt these new technologies.
Great, and we'll talk more about the future of these kinds of technologies in a little while. Karina, what are your silver linings? What would you say were the bright spots during these last 2 years?
Well, so I'm Karina Linch. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Brainpop. Before I was at Brainpop, I was a New York City public school teacher in both the Bronx and Brooklyn. I also have 3 little boys in public school, a kindergartner, a 3rd grader, and a 6th grader. And there were definitely silver linings professionally and personally during this time. So for Brainpop, you know, we have over 30% of US K-8 schools subscribe to Brainpop, and teachers would typically turn to us to introduce background knowledge, quickly ensure that the entire class was able to get a concept and key vocabulary before they launch into a lesson. And quite often they would do that through the whole class. And of course, when the pandemic happened, they had to switch their model to assigning work to students individually, ensuring every student was experiencing Brainpop through their one-to-one devices at home, and it required a lot of pivots and changes that had us really dig in and focus on improving things like co-teachers' abilities to go in and assign work to students, so we could have not just the classroom teacher, but also the paraprofessionals or the English language support teachers support children. And also focus on things like interoperability. Do we appear in the places where teachers need to quickly get into the classroom? Clever portals, things like that. So we really focused on access and equity and ensuring we could support all students through one-to-one devices. I'd say personally, there were so many silver linings in terms of parents being invited or at least present within their child's school day. So getting to see my son's 5th grade teacher hold his daughter on his lap while he was delivering Google Meet instruction. It helped me as a parent really get to know my children's teachers and my children, to be able to see them as whole individuals. Teachers also got to see children as whole individuals as they're invited into their bedrooms and kitchen tables. I also got to know the parents in my children's classrooms better, which sounds weird because you're not going into school and doing the bake sales and the fundraisers and stuff, but we joined together on WhatsApp groups, and we would do things like, when I was a teacher, we would do ask 3 before you ask me. So the parents themselves knew how stressed and overburdened the teachers were, and we would ask each other for help before we would actually reach out to the classroom teacher to what was going on. Many, many more silver linings, but there were rough times too.
And we'll get to those. But let's stay on the positive end of things. Kai-lee, your silver linings.
Yes, lots of silver linings, and I'm going to echo some of what my fellow panelists said. I'm Kylie Burke, co-founder of Noni Educational Solutions. I'm a lifelong early childhood educator, was a teacher for many years, an administrator, spent over a decade at a company called Teaching Strategies that serves the early childhood market. And at the start of the pandemic, I had a 9 and 13-year-old. It's crazy to think that 2 years have gone by. But I think for me, looking kind of more broadly, what the silver lining really has been is a much deeper sense of empathy. As parents became teachers, they understood how hard it is to be a teacher, the kind of special training that teachers need to be able to teach really well. I think for a lot of parents, that was a big aha. And kids seeing a glimpse into the lives of their teachers. I think my children knew their teachers better than they ever had before. And that really strengthened relationships. And that's something that was a surprise to me, that was something I did not anticipate through this time. My primary concern was that there would be this tremendous disconnect, but really through the technology portal, being able to see through video into someone's home, it really was this two-way street. Teachers being able to see into families' homes. Even in early childhood where home visits used to be a regular occurrence, it is very rare now to find programs and schools that do home visits. But when you are in a child's home, you learn so much about them. You learn about what their role is in the family, what their role is beyond their role of being a student, what responsibilities they have, what their space is like for learning. We saw how families communicate with each other. We saw glimpses into the parent-child relationship that we never would have seen before. And so I think that kind of visibility allowed for this development of empathy from the teacher and parent relationship to the teacher-child relationship to the child-teacher relationship. Everybody understands each other a little bit better now.
I have to say, given the work I was doing just when the pandemic hit at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, for me that was my most special silver lining, is the relationship, the strengthening of the relationships that were being formed between parents and teachers, and finally each of them honoring each other, seeing that the care that, on both at home but also in the teaching environment that exists between a teacher and that student, but also the parent and that child, and the empathy that comes from really understanding what families, too many families in this country experience, that are often hurdles to overcome for children to learn. So thank you for lifting that up. I'm gonna move us to the next, a little bit more difficult question. So on the flip side, we also saw the deep and pervasive disparities on full display. Many of these disparities required us to look at issues of race. So how has this racial reckoning penetrated the EdTech field? And if it has, in what ways? And what do you see changing or predict will change on that front? Any one of you can start us off. Go ahead.
Well,
Amelia.
Sorry, I'm just think so much to say on this. Working again in speech technology, this is a huge issue for us. We're talking about getting technology that will be a tool that helps teachers and saves them time by offering the teacher or the child themselves feedback on how well they're reading or pronouncing something. Now, if there is inherent bias in that technology, then it can be very, very dangerous. It can be dangerous not only across the board if it isn't accurate. It could tell children that they got something wrong when in fact they got it right, which can be very discouraging. They can tell something that's not accurate, could tell a child that they got something right when they got it wrong, which is also a bit dangerous. But then when you start looking at the different results of speech recognition tests, the different accuracy levels of speech recognition technology on black children, white children, Latino children, across the board, you need to be able to rely on the technology to treat these different cohorts of children exactly the same. And at Soapbox Labs, this is something that we have built into the product from the outset. We make sure that our technology is built on data that comes from children of all ages, all races, from all countries, different countries all over the world, using different speaking styles, engaging in different use cases basically, but also at different noise levels, like children will be using this technology in noisy environments, in classrooms, in homes. So not only do we build out our technology to be as equitable as possible, but we also test it all the time. So recently in the company, we've been testing to see how well our technology performs for African American English speakers, Latino and Chicano English speakers, and white English speakers. And we have found across the board that our technology shows no bias towards or against any particular group. Now, this test has also been backed up by independent testers. Dr. Yakov Petcher from the Florida Center for Reading Research recently did an analysis of our system by testing it with different cohorts of children, and found that, again, that there was no bias seen for any of the different cohorts that were tested. So this is something we're really, really proud of, and not only because it verifies what we strove to achieve, but also because we feel it's so, so important. And especially with COVID, I think the most worrying thing about it is the literacy gap is getting wider and wider, and COVID has not helped at all. I'm very passionate about adopting technology to try and counteract this, but it needs to be in a way that is equitable and treats all children exactly the same. And at Soapbox, that's what we're striving to do.
Karina?
Sure. I'll jump in and say one thing I saw when I was a teacher, and I'm concerned that this could be a focus right now, is when students are struggling and experiencing trauma, sometimes we double down on math and ELA, which are incredibly important, but sometimes we strip out the things that kids are super excited and coming to school for. And I saw this as a teacher in the Bronx, where we unfortunately lost some of our music and arts and science and social studies courses, so we could introduce more test prep into the day. And one of the things that I'm super passionate about is making sure we're furthering essential literacy skills through science and social studies, and giving kids, all kids, a chance to create and make and work on project-based learning. So at Brainpop, it's been important that students are able to not just complete a worksheet to show what they know about Martin Luther King's life, but code a museum in partnership with Scratch and actually select artifacts that they're going to build a project around to express and show what they know. So I think I want to make sure that as we focus on the real crisis that we have with the gaps in ELA and math, that we don't do it at the expense of why kids are so passionate and excited, and what makes them like really bring their authentic selves to school. I think it's also incredibly important that we make space for conversations where kids can voice how they're feeling. I saw this with my son's 5th grade teacher during the George Floyd protests. Every morning started off with conversations, checking in with kids, giving them space to talk about how they're feeling, what they're hearing in the news. And I think that's gave them the opportunity to bring up things that they might not have if they just started 9 a.m. with going right into academic subject areas. That's been important at Brainpop as well. So we bring in news events like covering the Black Lives Matter protests, or we cover what's happening with vaccines and the coronavirus, or make space for kids to just have conversations about things that they're curious about. We want to make sure that we're representative of all kids and have topics like Pride Month. And I think those conversations are important in schools. They allow kids to bring their whole selves into it. And I hope, if you saw the keynote this morning, I hope we continue to have those conversations.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going to, in the next segment, talk about some of the social emotional issues. So thank you for lifting that up. Kai-lee, tell us about this racial reckoning and just how you're thinking about it and how it can impact and influence the way EdTech leaders think about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but again, I come back to this idea of empathy and connection and understanding. And I think too often in our space, and I've been doing EdTech product creation for nearly 20 years now. Which is crazy to think I had a whole other life and career before that. But, too often the development happens by folks who are very well-intended and super smart, but who rely on market research and focus groups to tell them what is right and good and true for students and teachers and families. So it's my hope that coming out of this time and this social justice movement and change that we're seeing across the country, that way of developing EdTech is done. We're done with that. The people doing the creating need to be deeply connected to the communities that they serve. They need to understand what that lived experience is. If they have not walked a mile or 100 miles in a teacher's shoes, then they need to be spending time, real time in classrooms, knowing what it's like for a teacher, understanding the struggles on a daily basis of the students and teachers that ultimately they're serving. They need to spend time really listening, not listening to sell. Not listening to sell, but listening to learn and listening to understand the folks that they serve. I've been fortunate in my time in the industry to have some success with product development. And so folks will call on me from other organizations to look at their roadmap or to work with them on a specific product market fit or ask me to be on a board. And so the other day I was having a conversation with a group that was in that situation. And the very lovely CEO and CTO were talking to me about a recent focus group. And the CTO made this comment about how it's so weird. These teachers it's like they're just grateful to have somebody listening to them. And then they laughed, and the CEO laughed, and then they moved on. And all I could think was, wow. You have no idea who these people are. You have no idea this market you're serving. You're talking about childcare. 99% women, 60% women of color, women who have been systematically disenfranchised by the education system, many of whom don't have advanced degrees, many of whom fell into this profession because they grew up taking care of their younger siblings out of necessity. These women are not valued by society. Their voices are not heard. So yes, they are grateful when they feel like someone's listening. How can we make effective solutions for folks that we don't really know well? And I think that that's one example that, unfortunately, in my experience, has been all too common. You might be able to create a one-off product that's useful. That's possible. But if you're looking to innovate, if you're looking to change the game, if you're looking to close the gaps, then you need to be able to know this market well, know who you're serving, empathize with them, and really be from the communities that you're ultimately serving. Sorry, I feel a little bit strongly about it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's what this conversation is about, the kind of passion and courage to think about how EdTech can truly serve to close the pernicious gaps that exist for way too many kids. So bring that passion on. Amelia, were you going to jump in a little earlier? No. I saw you pick up your mic, and I thought maybe you wanted to jump in.
No, just it's very passionate.
Well, let me just build on what Kylie said and acknowledge that Soapbox has done a tremendous job in really paying attention to issues of race and disparity and social justice all woven in. How do we inspire, motivate, I don't like to use the word force, but how do we get other technology companies to follow suit? What's the pathway forward here?
I think that, Kylie, what you said there about just getting to know the teachers, getting to know the classrooms, I think that's super important because when you build technology that works, then it gets adopted. I think when bigger technology companies see that, then they say, oh, well, obviously what is it that they're doing different? How can we copy that? Unfortunately, when it comes to things like capitalism, it's really that whatever sells, whatever is going to work, that's what people do. And I think that there are good ways to go about that and bad ways to go about it. And the way that I favor and the way that Soapbox Labs has adopted is to talk to teachers, to be in the classrooms, to listen to the audio from children in the classroom, the way they speak, the way they read, the types of mistakes they make, where they struggle, and then use those decisions to inform how you build the technology. So I have done this, and my team has done this, and we've talked to teachers about, we say, what would you be doing? What would you do if you were assessing a child's oral reading fluency, for example? How do you fill out this form? How do you mark in the mistakes and the errors? And then how do you calculate it at the end? And when we look at that, we realize that when you build speech technology, it's not very useful just to return a transcription of everything the child said. You need extra data points. You need to know whether they repeated a word, whether they made a false start, whether their voice went up or down at the end, whether they paused a long time between the words. These are the bits of information that the teachers want, and that's what they've told us they wanted, and that's what we've built for them. So we want to build technology that does data analysis and analyzes the audio file and the children's speech and reading patterns in a way that's useful for the teachers, so that we can solve the problems, not so we can sell something, and not so the company gets bigger, but so we actually solve a problem. There has to be a double bottom line here when you're talking about business. You can't just be trying to sell something. You need to be making the world a better place as well, because otherwise, honestly, what's the point?
Any other thoughts before we move on to?
I would absolutely agree with user research and continually going into the classroom and embedding with teachers. The teachers are beta testers, they are first users. We read every comment that comes in from them. It was really hard during the pandemic to physically get into classrooms, so we had to look at how do we do things like diary studies with teachers just using their cell phone to record. How do we really understand what's going on now, because it's so different than when they were able to be in person. How is it shifting now that they're back in the classroom, but they have a lot of new technology and resources that are going in with them. And I think it's incredibly important to be present with teachers. I think one of the most important things our team says that we can do is save teachers time. So we're continually looking at how can we make our product more efficient, deliver insights to teachers faster so that they can spend less time on lesson planning or prepping or aligning to standards. How can we build all that in and make it really seamless so we can have them able to spend more time with students in the classroom. So we're looking at like their natural usage frequency and looking at things like our animated movies are incredibly popular, and we have assessments sitting alongside. What if we embed the assessments directly into the movies to provide teachers with really quick insights to understand where they might need to pivot or reinforce a particular piece of content? I think if we can focus on serving teachers and saving them time, they're going to put that time to very good use.
And I'd challenge EdTech companies to look at who are the folks doing the development. Really, who are the people building the solutions, conceiving of the solutions, and do those people reflect the lived experiences of the communities you're serving? And if the answer is no, then find those people and bring those people into the team. I'm not saying that we should discount the experience of a brilliant, gifted technologist who can bring so much to the table, who may be far removed from the community. That person is valuable too, but the team itself has to reflect those lived experiences if you want to have an authentic voice and an authentic solution in the marketplace.
Let's take on this question that's related to this part of the conversation. How do you balance the equity of technology with the privacy of minority students, knowing that collected data could be used negatively if it's in the wrong hands?
This is an excellent question, and this is something that's always at the forefront of our mind when we're dealing with data from children. It's super, super important that we not only comply by privacy laws for storing data and keeping it safe, but also that we have privacy by design buried in our product from the very get-go. There's like in Soapbox Labs, for example, we only use audio data from children to build models, speech models that will make our technology better and that will more accurately transcribe the speech of all students. We never obviously sell, license, or give away this data to anybody, and this in itself, and surprisingly, makes us different from every other speech company out there. Other companies that you might know, some of the bigger companies, they're not just giving you free email addresses, they're not just giving you free search engines, they are collecting your data and your usage behaviors, and they're using that to advertise to you. That's their business model, that's how they make money. If I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that when they first heard that teachers, might put an Amazon Echo in the classroom, they, the visceral feeling of, oh God, don't do that, was just so overwhelming. And I can absolutely understand that. You really, really need to know that if you're going to be using some kind of technology, you need to know that the data is safe and it's not being used to profile children or sell them anything or any other competing business model. So at Soapbox, we have a privacy by design approach where we never sell data, we never share it, we never use it for anything other than to make our system work better for every student in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think if you start product development with this in mind, I've had two very different experiences with this. One, in the early childhood sector at Teaching Strategies, I developed an assessment tool with my team called GOLD, which is the most widely used assessment solution in early childhood. And to watch how that assessment tool changed over time. Once you put something out into the market, you lose control in a lot of ways. And so to see how that data was being used for good was amazing. To watch it be used in ways that I thought negatively impacted teachers or negatively impacted communities was heartbreaking as a developer of a tool that I still believe is incredibly powerful. So in NONI, in the development of our work there, working with trauma-impacted children and families and teachers, it was so important to ensure the privacy, so important to ensure that data didn't get misused, particularly when you're talking about trauma. That includes children showing up in a state of dysregulation in our classroom, and those are those challenging behaviors, right? You don't want that to follow a child forever into the universe. So building the product in such a way so that data could never be accessed. The data lived only with the teacher and nobody else. So being really mindful, thinking about what are all the ways this could ultimately be misused so that you can head that off at the start of product design.
Thank you all. I think this is going to be the conversation for this year, next year, and hopefully as many EdTech companies get it right on behalf of children. So let's turn now, this might be our final question. Let's turn to the urgent responsibility in front of us at the moment. One, as Kylie just mentioned, is to address the trauma that too many children in this country experienced as a result of not just the pandemic, but all that the pandemic brought, all the disruption, all the ways in which families were impacted. And also, our urgent responsibility to close the learning gaps that spiked higher than ever over the last 2 years, especially for low-income children and children of color. By the way, we already knew before the pandemic that 80% of third graders in this country cannot read at grade level. 80% of low-income children in this country do not read at grade level. We already had gaps. How can technology tools at our disposal assist us in closing these gaps? But also, how can they help us nurture and heal children? And coming full circle to the first conversation, how can it continue to help us improve those relationships between the adults, but also with children?
Can I? I think those two things are so interrelated, Yolie. You can't do one without the other. We know, talking about prior to the pandemic and what we knew, that over 60% of children, nearly 2/3 of children under the age of 16 reported experiencing at least one traumatic event. And we know that those numbers have only gotten worse over the last 24 months. We have about 175,000 children who lost their primary caregiver to COVID, and that doesn't account for the aunties and the tutus and the grandmas who were the backbones of these communities. We know that the number of child abuse victims tripled in the last 18 months. It tripled. First, we didn't know. We weren't seeing them outside the home anymore, but now researchers have been able to extrapolate from ER data that that number has tripled. We know that 40% of US adults reported experiencing mental health issues and substance abuse issues, and that ER visits for mental health emergencies for children ages 5 to 11 years old rose by 31%. And we know that suicide attempts for young girls increased by 51% in this time period. So when we're talking about trauma, we have all had very shared high stress experiences. Housing insecurity, food insecurity have impacted communities. The amount of trauma impacting students is so great. And trauma impacts a person's ability to regulate their stress response. So we've got kids showing up in our classrooms in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, right? That stress, that exposure to toxic stress, which is what happens during trauma, that impacts our brains and our bodies in lots of ways. And one way is that the brain strengthens some neural pathways and weakens others during that time. So if I'm in fight, flight, or freeze mode, I'm on high alert. I'm ready to run, ready to fight. The neural pathways in my brain related to being able to engage in those kinds of behaviors, those are being strengthened, while the ones related to impulse control and self-regulation and emotional control, those are being weakened. And if you think about what impact that has on young children, when the very architecture of their brains is being built, and this is what's happening in their brains and bodies, that has a dramatic impact on their ability to learn. Children in stress response mode are not in learning mode. You actually cannot access your prefrontal cortex when you are in stress response mode. That's the thinking part of your brain. So this idea of addressing trauma is so integrated, interwoven with our ability to close these gaps, to help with the learning loss, that you really cannot separate the two.
I'd say for Brainpop, not only do we have topics that explicitly address things like stress and social emotional learning, but we've also built new products with social emotional learning built in from the beginning. So we just launched a Brainpop Science product, and students reflecting on how they're feeling about the lesson and serving up emojis and feedback on their teacher on how they felt as they moved through the lesson is kind of built in from the get-go. And I think part of inclusive design, we use universal design for learning principles at Brainpop to ensure there's multiple means for students to experience content, and there's multiple means for them to express themselves. And I think it's very important with the trauma that children have experienced that we give them multiple means to express themselves within the work that they're doing at school, so that they're not just completing homework and filling out tests, but they're creating and making projects where they have a voice, where they have agency, where they have choice over what they're producing. And I think that that is necessary in every EdTech product.
I think that the adoption of technology, sometimes people get a bit scared of it. They start to think, well, are you just trying to replace the teacher? So that's something that we hear quite a bit, but really how I want to address this question is I think that the adoption of technology is something that can really free up a teacher's time. When you're talking about students coming back to classrooms, I'm not a teacher myself, but my mother is a retired teacher, and I have a lot of friends who have teachers, and one of the main topics of their conversations is how worried they are about the children who they haven't seen in a while over COVID, who didn't come to the online classroom, who just disappeared off-grid for weeks and months, and they're terribly, terribly worried about these kids, and they want to give them as much time as they can. Now that the schools are open again, the children are coming back, the teachers want to devote their time to the children, nurturing them, talking to them, finding out where the learning gaps are and addressing them. I really hope that technology will be adopted so it can play a part in freeing up the teachers' time so that they can do this. So allowing the kids to practice their reading in a way that they won't even notice that they are being continually monitored and assessed, not in a formal way necessarily, but in a way that will allow the teacher to see their progress over time, see how much they've practiced, and then intervene when it's necessary, when it's appropriate, when you can see that they're dropping off or they're not actually engaging anymore, you'll be able to see that. But to have all that information fed up to the teacher in a way that the teacher then can look at it as a big picture over the entire classroom and say, right, okay, well, I think that I need to talk to this student and that student. I need to spend some time here and there. And I think that's really, really a very important benefit of adopting technology in the classroom. Another one, of course, is the wait lists for things like speech therapy are through the roof now because of COVID. You've got wait lists that are 5 years long for children to go to a speech therapist and get some, intervention that they need. Speech technology can also help in this regard with educational technology and speech therapy tools that children can practice on their own time using tablets, using mobile phones, and using speech recognition technology in the background that would allow the speech therapist, again, like the teacher, to monitor the progress of all the people that they're in touch with over time. It will really free up time for all these educators to be where they need to be in order to lessen the trauma of these kids and everything that they've gone through in the last few years.
Yeah, in the development, that work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, our primary question was, how can we use technology to strengthen the relationship between the teacher and the child? And so it's taking that use of technology and the relationship kind of one step further. And I think really as we're looking at the future of EdTech, that's a primary question that we should be asking, whether it's by freeing up time so it allows the teacher more opportunities to be present and be one-on-one supporting children, or it's tools that help guide the teacher toward what the relationship needs, what the child needs to be able to regulate, helping the teacher to be able to facilitate relationship building between children. That primary question of how can technology strengthen a relationship between a teacher and a student is one that I think we really all need to be asking ourselves now.
We have another question from the audience, so I'm going to throw that over to each of you. How do you measure the effectiveness of SEL via content? Any thoughts?
So having created a whole child assessment tool that actually assesses areas of social emotional learning and development, that is certainly one way that you can track and measure children's progress and development over time. There are indicators that show growth in children's learning and understanding of social emotional development and learning. But I think another really important way is, and I know this isn't everybody's favorite because everybody loves to have data, but really is through connection with teachers and anecdotally what's happening in the classroom. Are we seeing fewer referrals for behaviors? How do teachers feel at the start and end of their day? Is that changing over time? Do our educators feel like they are supported, like they have a sustainable self-care practice, and not in a trite way, but in a way that it truly helps them to regulate their own emotions and behaviors? So I think you certainly can use data from an assessment tool that has been research proven and has a research base, but I think it's also really important to look for the anecdotal data as well.
I would agree. I would say look at what teachers are choosing to use. What are they bringing into their classroom to spark conversations, to facilitate that kind of support, and look at what they're engaging with kids on. I think I agree there's a lot of tools that you can use to get data points, but look at what teachers are selecting and using to foster those conversations in the classroom and make a connection.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, obviously as a scientist, I love the data as well. But, you've piles of data. There's data everywhere. How do you know what to look for? I think by talking to the teachers and talking to the people on the coalface of what's going on, then you got ideas of how to analyze the data. Data's no good if it can't tell a story, if you can't look for the things that you need to find in it. So yeah, talking to people who are on the ground working with this all the time, that's how you really get your insights.
I'm going to circle back to parents. And I'll start by telling you about the story of Melody. Melody is my 5th grade niece. She's at Compton Unified in California, and lives in a home with a mom who works full-time, grandparents, one of whom works full-time. And at the start of the pandemic, had no guidance at all, except to call Auntie Yolie. But days went by before she called Auntie Yolie, and in the meantime, she didn't know, and neither did Mom, and neither did Grandmother, what it meant to enter a URL into the URL box. Didn't know what a hotspot was. And this is just the experience of millions of children in this country. What is the role of EdTech in facilitating that learning, not just for children, not just for the student, but for the family member who is very much a part of the learning in that child's life?
I can start. I mean, I think it's incredibly important that we have tools and resources that take the technical facilitation or that role of parents where they needed to literally technically manage their kids' school and try and remove some of that burden. So I know Google Classroom and Clever are looking at ways to make it simpler and simpler to have portals or entry points where you don't need to have be a tech teacher or a teacher that's received PD and training to quickly get into products. For those of us that make products that live within those places, how do we make it interoperable and seamless so that you don't have to think about how to get into the product or remember a password or assign it or access your assignment, and just make it seamless and frictionless, as well as ensuring that all your resources are in multiple languages, they're accessible. So we partnered with Microsoft Immersive Reader to ensure that our product is available in multiple languages so parents can experience the product alongside their children. So I think just frictionless accessibility, ensuring your product is equitable for both students, teachers, and parents as well is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody was so caught off guard. It never occurred to most school systems to think that they needed to play that role or that EdTech companies would ever need to play that role. I've been doing EdTech development work for a couple of decades, and I still am crap at logging into my kids' Power School, and I have 14 other accounts to access different things that they're doing in different classrooms, and I don't. I mean, I'm just truly, honestly, I should be the person who's perfect at it, and I am not. And so, yeah, I love what you said about trying to make it frictionless and seamless. But I do think that we've seen, I am a bit of a silver linings person. I do think that we've seen school districts are much more prepared now. We all, as EdTech folks, we are more prepared. And this, what you were talking about at the start about how progress was so slow and it seemed like it moved at this sort of dinosaur pace. We had innovation like overnight and problems being solved so quickly and so dynamically, and communities coming together to work with EdTech developers to solve these problems. You know, my hope is that that energy continues and we see more solutions coming out of that space. My fear is that it just goes back. You know, it goes back to business as usual. Kids are back at school. I've got this big chasm now between home and school, so my relationships with the teachers will change. EdTech can slow down because things are going back to the way they were. Like, that's the fear. And so I really feel like as a community, it's our responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen, that this pace of innovation continues.
Absolutely. It would be such a missed opportunity if we went back and didn't really leverage all of the silver linings that we've talked about, and all of the imagination and creativity and urgency. So yes, it's on all of us to maintain that sense of urgency. We're getting close to time, but there's one last question, so I'll read it. Actually, there's two questions now. As teachers are required to facilitate technology, what role do you think EdTech can play or should play in teacher credentialing and professional development?
I feel like this is one we've been talking about for a long time. And if you've been coming to this conference for a while, I think I was on a panel 5 years ago or 6 years ago where we talked about this topic. This is one where I'd love to continue to see the pace of innovation keep up. I think it's awesome that so much of what has historically been face-to-face PD shifted to, you know, being virtual, and people are way more comfortable with it now, and school systems are more comfortable with it now in a lot of ways that democratizes professional development opportunities and allows for access where there might not have been access in the past. So I think EdTech has a big role to play here. I'd love to see, you know, for those of you who are entrepreneurs in the audience, I'd love to see people really going after this with job-embedded professional development. I know, again, that's been something we've been talking about for a decade, but there has to be a way to solve that. And I feel like we got, you know, at least incrementally closer to that vision of a future over the last couple of years. So I think that's one of the most pressing needs, particularly in my sector of the education market and early childhood, you know, that birth through third grade time frame, helping folks get the professional development and credentialing that they need.
I think EdTech companies have an obligation to ensure that they're not just training teachers on how to use their products, but really ensuring that they're leveling up best practices. So when you go through our Certified Brainpop Educator program, yes, you will learn the product more deeply and you will learn how to you know, deliver it in your classroom, but you're also going to learn how to shift from a very teacher-centric practice to a more student-centric practice. And we actually measure teachers' intent to change their practice after going through our certification. And then we go back and survey them again to see if they actually did change their practice. So I would say EdTech providers have an obligation not just to train on how to use the product, but how to actually implement best practices in the classroom.
From my point of view, so the Soapbox don't make anything that teachers use themselves. Rather, we partner with EdTech companies so that they can integrate the voice technology into their product. So when it comes to talking to teachers and the end users of the EdTech that will have the voice technology in it, I always say that, like, it shouldn't really be a huge learning curve to understand what voice technology is for a teacher. What they need to understand is that here is something that's useful, and here is why you can trust it. And we need to be able to furnish these users with the evidence they need to be able to trust it, and anything that might be useful for them to know, rather than having to tell, like, I mean, if I buy a microwave, I don't need to know about microwave technology. I need to know that there's a set of standards that means my kitchen won't explode, and I need to know that my cup of coffee will get hot in the same way every time, no matter what coffee it is. And that's all I need to know. I don't need somebody telling me all the stuff that, it will just be like, yeah, whatever. I just want to know if it works or not. So from my point of view, I think that is how much we need to actually communicate on this issue. But of course, if anybody does want to ask any questions about acoustic modeling, you're welcome.
We'll take that question too. We have one more. I think we talked about who bears the responsibility of frictionless implementation. But if you wanted to add, I think the most important thing is naming that we're all responsible for keeping up that sense of urgency for change and to continue to adapt. Mm-hmm. But wonder if anybody else has anything to add there.
So I know immediately who I don't want to bear the burden of that friction, and that's teachers and students and parents. So I think it really is on EdTech companies, and also to just have those conversations with those who are making decisions at the district level. What is your goal, and how do you expect this product to play with all the other products you're using? Is it a supplemental product? How is it going to complement your core offering? And really make sure that there's clear intent and understanding on how a product will get used, how it'll be implemented, what's the expectations for usage, and then that's clearly communicated to teachers and ensure that friction is not felt in the classroom when they haven't been given guidance on what the expectations are.
Well, we're getting close to time, and I want to give each of you the opportunity to make a final reflection or share a final comment. We've clearly learned a lot in the last 2 years and found some silver linings. Know that there are still challenges in front of us, but maybe your closing remarks can talk about your aspirations for EdTech in helping to continue to move us forward in closing gaps for children.
So I'd really like to see more adoption of voice technology in educational technology products. I think that it's only limited by our imaginations. There are so many different ways that you can integrate voice to make things easier. One of the ways is to make things frictionless. There's a lot of problems solved out there, and I think it's up to the innovators to come along and piece it all together and make sure that we're making EdTech that works for the children, the teachers, and people who need to use them without too much of a barrier to entry. So I hope to see mass adoption of speech technology in EdTech products, and I'm hoping that it will go a long way to closing the literacy gap.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. Karina.
I'd say we need to keep focusing on time as EdTech creators and providers. Teachers don't have time to go back and reteach everything that students have missed to close those gaps. That's just not going to be effective. How can we help them accelerate learning? How can we identify those grade level essential skills that students need to make progress towards standards and help them get there faster? Because it does really, there is an urgency to close gaps quickly, and I think we can do a lot to accelerate that.
And I would, of course, make the plug for continued innovation and empathy and understanding of really the whole child, also the whole teacher, what has transpired over the last 2 years, and to use this as an opportunity to really build in the right supports for strengthening those relationships in the classroom, as well as continuing to strengthen those relationships between home and school.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to Baron, Suchi, Megan, and Hannah for the great questions that continue to engage our conversation. Thank you to Amelia Kelly of Soapbox, to Kai-lee, at Noni Educational Solutions, and Karina, Chief Product Officer at Brainpop. Please help me thank our speakers, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.